Welcome to a journey through one of the most unsettling tales ever to resonate within these silent valleys. You may be watching from the comfort of your own home, but I assure you that by the conclusion of this narrative, you will perceive the shadows in a new light. Let us know in the comments where you are joining us from tonight. This video is a fictional work crafted purely for entertainment. Any similarity to real individuals, living or deceased, is entirely coincidental. There was an era when the roads of Missouri were merely dirt paths, meandering between hills, cloaked in thick forests and valleys, where mist collected like a heavy shroud. In the heart of Webster County, far removed from major cities, stood a property that would eventually become known simply as the Cartwright House. This was not an official designation found on maps or in records. It was a name bestowed by travelers and locals alike, always uttered in hushed voices and with a distinct sense of disquiet. The structure appeared around 1902, during a time when that region of Missouri still bore the weight of a recently tamed frontier. Those who chose to dwell in such isolated places were inherently different. They sought distance and privacy. Perhaps they were escaping from something. The Cartwright House sat at the end of a winding lane, branching off from the main road, concealed amidst ancient oaks and enveloped by a silence that felt unnaturally dense. The property included a two-story house of dark wood that seemed to absorb sunlight, as if pushing it away. At the rear stood a barn, a stone cistern, and several smaller outbuildings that appeared erected without plan, as if they had sprouted up as needed. The land was vast, roughly 50 acres, stretching to where the forest consumed all traces of civilization. No one knew precisely who had originally built the house. Some claimed it was a solitary farmer from the east. Others spoke of a wealthy fur trader who had decided to settle far from prying eyes. What all agreed upon was that the house consistently seemed to attract a particular type of occupant-reserved individuals who did not attend local churches or participate in community gatherings in the nearest town, Springfield, nearly a day's wagon ride away. The first peculiar reports about the property began circulating through local warehouses and taverns a few years after its construction. Travelers on the main road recounted seeing strange lights in the house's windows during the early morning hours, moving from room to room without apparent pattern. Others swore they heard sounds emanating from that direction, echoes resembling nothing familiar, neither wildlife nor ordinary human labor. But these were times when superstition and reality easily intertwined. Wolves still howled in the Missouri woods, and ghost stories were a natural part of local lore. Thus, these accounts were met with interest, though not necessarily alarm. After all, who truly cared what happened on an isolated property so long as it affected no one else? However, what could not be ignored was the alarming frequency with which residents of the Cartwright House departed. Someone would move in, stay for a few months or a year, and then leave without explanation. Sometimes they abandoned everything: furniture, tools, personal belongings, as if fleeing in haste with no intent to return. Other times, the house would simply sit empty overnight, with no one witnessing the departure. In 1908, a couple we shall refer to as Margaret and Thomas took over the property. Hailing from Kansas, they sought a fresh start away from unspecified troubles. Margaret was known for her skill with medicinal herbs, while Thomas was an experienced carpenter. They seemed like ordinary, hard-working people, the kind who could prosper even in such seclusion. The initial months passed normally. Thomas made repairs to the house, fixed the barn roof, and reinforced fences. Margaret planted a garden and occasionally visited town to sell her herbs. They were polite, if reserved, and gradually gained acceptance within the local community. But then something shifted. Margaret stopped going to town. When Thomas appeared alone to purchase supplies, he was altered thinner, paler, with deep shadows under his eyes, and hands that trembled as he counted money. Inquiries about his wife were met with vague replies. He claimed she was fine, merely tired, and preferring to stay home. Yet his eyes held a recognizable fear. The owner of the general store, an observant man familiar with the area, noticed Thomas buying unusual quantities of specific items: heavy chains, long nails, hardwood for structural reinforcement, and large amounts of coarse salt quantities, unreasonable for mere meat preservation. Then, one winter morning, Thomas simply ceased to appear. Neither he nor Margaret were seen again. The Cartwright house fell silent once more, its windows dark like empty eyes watching the encircling woods. It was then that the rumors truly gained momentum, whispered among neighbors, and noted in the margins of local newspapers, weaving the place into a dark legend that would persist for decades. For what transpired within those walls, hidden by dark timber and isolation, was only beginning to reveal its true nature, a nature far more disturbing than anyone could have imagined. The property lay abandoned for months after Thomas and Margaret vanished. Snow covered the fields, ice clung to the eaves, and the silence around the house deepened further. No one dared approach. An instinctive feeling warned that crossing its boundary would be a mistake. When spring finally thawed the ice and returned green to the Missouri valleys, a man we will fictitiously call Robert Dalton decided to investigate. Known as a practical, no-nonsense cattle rancher and businessman, he saw opportunity in the abandoned land. Good acreage was scarce, and those 50 acres held value, stories notwithstanding. Robert arrived at the Cartwright house on a clear April afternoon. The path was overgrown with dead leaves and fallen branches, showing no recent passage. Reaching the clearing, he halted. Even for a skeptic, the scene was unsettling. The house appeared to have aged excessively in mere months. The wood was darker, almost black in patches, and the windows were covered from within. He tied his horse and approached the front door, finding it unlocked, an oddity even for an abandoned property. Robert pushed the door open slowly. It creaked, echoing through the empty interior. The smell struck him first. Not the expected decay, but something indefinable, damp and heavy, like wet earth mixed with a metallic tinge. Covering his nose with a handkerchief, he entered. The main room was in disarray, but not randomly so. Furniture was piled against one wall as a barricade. The kitchen table was overturned. Deep scratches marred the walls, as if something heavy had been dragged repeatedly. On the floor, strange patterns were drawn in ash or charcoal circles and meaningless symbols. Robert ascended the creaking stairs to the second floor. The first room was entirely empty. The second held a destroyed bed, its mattress torn and feathers scattered. But the third room made him stop cold. The walls were covered in writing entire sentences, carved deeply into the wood. They were warnings. "Don't sleep," repeated dozens of times. "They come when it gets dark." "The cistern knows," and centered on the wall opposite the window, in large, irregular letters, "Run while you can." A chill ran down Robert's spine. Rational as he was, this was too disturbing to dismiss. Who had written this? Thomas? Margaret? Some prior resident? And what did "the cistern knows" mean? He hurried downstairs, intent on leaving, but paused at the back door. Through the grimy window, he saw the stone cistern in the yard, a cylindrical structure about 1.5 meters high, its wooden lid partially shifted. Against his better judgment, Robert went out to it. The sound of his footsteps in the tall grass seemed overly loud. Approaching, he noted fingerprints and deep grooves on the stone rim, as if someone had clung to it desperately. He pushed the lid fully aside. The interior was dark, and the odor rising from it was worse than anything he had encountered. He did not look long, just enough to discern indistinct shapes at the bottom and to know it was not merely water. Robert stepped back, replaced the lid, and returned to his horse swiftly. He did not run, for proud men did not flee empty houses, but his stride was firm and determined. He rode back along the path without a single glance behind. That evening at the local tavern, he recounted what he had seen, not with drama, but in the controlled tone of a man processing the inexplicable. He spoke of the writings, the strange disorder, the cistern. He stated that something profoundly wrong had occurred in that house, something beyond mere abandonment. Some listeners were skeptical. Others, especially older locals familiar with the tales, merely shook their heads in silence. One white-haired man who rarely spoke finally said quietly, "That house should have been burned. It should always have been burned." Yet no one acted, for despite the fear and stories, a part of everyone wished to stay far enough away to avoid taking action. It was easier to leave the Cartwright House isolated and forgotten, patiently awaiting the next unsuspecting soul to cross its threshold. And inevitably, as always happened, someone would come, for the house had a way of drawing people in, as if whispering promises through the forest, offering refuge, land, a new beginning. Each time, those who accepted the invitation discovered too late that some places harbor memories far older and darker than any record could hold. Years passed, and the Cartwright House remained empty, gradually becoming a somber landmark in the Webster County landscape. People avoided mentioning it in daily conversation, but on cold nights, when the wind howled through the valleys, the stories resurfaced like persistent ghosts. Each generation added its own layers to the myth. Each storyteller contributed new details until separating fact from fiction became impossible. In 1915, the property found new occupants. A couple from Illinois, whom we will call Eleanor and Samuel, arrived in Missouri seeking deliberate isolation. Eleanor was a landscape painter in search of solitude. Samuel, an aspiring writer, believed the hill's silence would foster his creativity. Learning of the available, secluded property thrilled them. The lawyer handling the transaction vaguely mentioned the house had stories, but they saw this as rustic charm, the kind of lore that made a place more intriguing. What artist wouldn't want to live in a house with a mysterious reputation? They arrived on a summer afternoon, with the sun shining brightly over the hills, casting a welcoming glow. The house, despite its wear, seemed to need only some care. Eleanor saw potential in the large windows and natural light for her studio. Samuel imagined where he would place his desk and manuscripts. The first weeks were spent cleaning, organizing, and reviving the long-forgotten space. Eleanor painted the interior walls white, covering the strange marks they found. Samuel repaired doors, replaced broken glass, and brought in new furniture. Gradually, the Cartwright House began to appear almost normal, almost safe. Eleanor set up her studio in the largest upstairs room with the best morning light, positioning her easel by the window to paint the surrounding landscapes, the rolling hills, ancient oaks, and expansive fields. Her work flowed well, perhaps better than ever. Samuel settled into a small ground-floor office, waking early to make strong coffee and type at his novel, a story about the American frontier and the secrets the land holds. Inspiration seemed boundless there. But as summer yielded to autumn, minor disturbances began. There were sounds at night creaks, cracks, footsteps that could be attributed to the house settling or animals in the attic. Eleanor mentioned waking sometimes with the feeling of someone standing beside the bed, watching. But upon opening her eyes, she found only darkness and Samuel asleep. Unconsciously, Eleanor's paintings began to change. Her landscapes grew darker and more somber. Skies shifted from light blue to heavy gray. Trees shed their leaves prematurely. She did not understand why her hands chose these colors, or why her brushes created such oppressive atmospheres. Samuel's work also shifted. His novel, initially an adventure about courageous pioneers, morphed into something else. His characters became more disturbed and tormented. His scenes adopted increasingly dark tones, exploring deep fears, growing paranoia, and the sensation of being trapped with no escape. One night, Eleanor came downstairs to find Samuel sitting in the dark living room, staring at the unlit fireplace. When she asked what he was doing, he hesitated before finally answering that he was listening. Pressed for what he heard, Samuel turned to her with a strange expression and whispered, "The house is breathing." She laughed nervously, attempting to dispel the awkward tension that had settled in. Samuel was entirely serious. He explained that by staying perfectly still, he could perceive a rhythm within the house, a subtle pulse in the walls, a pattern in the creaking floorboards, as if the structure itself were somehow alive and aware of their presence. Eleanor tried to dismiss his words, attributing them to overwork and the long hours he spent writing. Yet she too had begun to sense something indefinable, a presence, the feeling that when she turned away from an empty room, something would shift in the shadows just at the edge of her vision. The mirror in their bedroom became a particular source of unease. Sometimes, passing by it, Eleanor swore she caught a reflection of something that shouldn't be there, a figure standing in the corner, a shadow denser than the rest. But turning to look directly revealed nothing. She started covering the mirror with a cloth at night. Samuel's sleep grew fractured. Eleanor would wake to find him sitting upright in bed, eyes wide, staring at the bedroom door. When she asked what was wrong, he would insist he'd heard someone climbing the stairs, stopping outside their door to wait. But opening it revealed only an empty hallway, plunged into a darkness that felt unnaturally thick. They began discussing leaving. Eleanor wanted to return to Illinois, to admit the isolation was too much. Samuel resisted, arguing they couldn't abandon everything, that it would be a sign of weakness, that the stories were just stories. Yet his voice lacked conviction. He was frightened too, even if he wouldn't admit it. It was then that Eleanor decided to explore the cellar, a place they had avoided since moving in. The door leading down was secured from the inside with a heavy latch, and an instinct had told them to leave it be. But now, driven by a desperate need to understand what was happening, she descended the stone stairs on a gloomy afternoon. What she found below would change everything, revealing the true nature of the Cartwright House, and making all the sleepless nights and bad premonitions seem merely the beginning of something far larger and older than they could have imagined. The cellar of the Cartwright House was distinct from the rest of the building. While the upper floors were wooden, this underground space was excavated directly into the bedrock and reinforced with fitted stone, creating a cold, damp environment that felt ancient. Eleanor descended the uneven steps with a lamp, its flame flickering and casting dancing shadows on the rough walls. The air was heavy with dampness, and a mineral scent like wet earth mixed with rusted iron. The space was expansive, stretching beyond her lamplight. Feeling along the walls, she discovered deliberately carved niches, natural shelves holding objects left over years, empty bottles, rusted tools, and lengths of chain-gathering dust. But at the cellar's far end, Eleanor found something that made her halt completely. Symbols were carved directly into the rock interwoven circles and lines, forming complex, precise geometric patterns. At their center was a circular area on the floor, where the stone had been worn smooth, as if polished by generations of footsteps over decades, or perhaps centuries. Kneeling, she ran her fingers over the stone. It was icy, far colder than the depth alone could explain. Raising her lamp, she noticed writing among the symbols' texts in unrecognizable languages, some seemingly Latin, others entirely foreign. Interspersed were more recent inscriptions in English, carved with less skill but equal intensity. These fragmented messages told of dreams that didn't end upon waking, of voices whispering through the walls in unknown tongues, and warnings against sleeping after midnight, against letting lights go out, against ever answering when something called your name. A shiver ran down Eleanor's spine. These texts weren't from Thomas and Margaret. They were older, layered warnings left by years of occupants, each trying to alert the next to inexplicable dangers. Then she heard it, a low, rhythmic creaking from somewhere deeper than should be possible underground. Turning, she raised her lamp, but the cellar was empty. The sound continued, accompanied by a whisper so faint it almost blended with the wind. Yet it held structure and intention, something dangerously close to words. Eleanor recoiled, heart racing, the lamp shaking in her hands. She stumbled up the stairs faster than she had descended, nearly dropping the light. Emerging on the ground floor, she slammed and latched the cellar door, breathing heavily from exertion and sheer terror. Samuel found her there, pale and trembling. She tried to describe what she'd seen, the symbols, the texts, the feeling of something more in that darkness. Samuel listened silently, his face growing grave. Then he did something unexpected. He retrieved an old, leather-bound notebook from his desk. He explained he'd found it weeks earlier, hidden between floorboards in his office, and hadn't mentioned it to avoid alarming her. The notebook contained diary entries in various handwritings from different residents over the years. Early entries, dated decades back, began with optimism about a new life, but quickly shifted to mentions of sleeplessness, disturbing dreams that lingered after waking, and a growing sense of being watched. Later, writers described similar patterns of deterioration into paranoia and fear. One mentioned discovering ancient documents on the property, suggesting the land had been used for rituals and forgotten practices long before the house was built. Attempts to reach something beyond the physical world. The final entry, in shaky handwriting from just a few years prior, claimed the writer had understood the truth. The problem wasn't the house, but the earth beneath it, something ancient that original inhabitants had known and marked as forbidden. The entry ended mid-sentence, as if interrupted or abandoned. The remaining pages were blank, waiting for the next resident to add their story to this record of terror. Eleanor and Samuel spent that night awake in the living room, all lamps lit. They debated leaving immediately, yet something held them back. Not stubbornness, but a subtle, insidious feeling that they had stayed too long, that the house now knew them and wouldn't let them leave easily. At sunrise, golden light brought relief, making threats feel less real. Perhaps they could simply walk away. But deep down, both knew the Cartwright House wasn't finished with them, and that the coming night would bring revelations rendering everything prior a mere prologue. The decision to leave was made that clear morning, but execution proved strangely difficult. As they packed, small obstacles arose inexplicably. The rented cart for their belongings broke a wheel before loading. New ropes unraveled. Several of Eleanor's paintings vanished from her studio. Samuel's carefully organized manuscripts were found scattered. What should have been a morning departure stretched into an afternoon of mounting frustration. As the sunset painted the sky, they realized with discomfort they would spend another night there. One last night, they promised, leaving at first light even if it meant abandoning half their things. Night fell, moonless and starless, a dense darkness enveloping the Missouri hills. They lit every lamp, filling the house with an amber glow that only deepened the shadows. Staying together in the main room, they kept a fierce fire burning in the fireplace, the heat intense but preferable to letting darkness creep in. The early hours passed in tense silence. Both tried to read, but words failed to make sense. Their attention was constantly pulled to the sounds of the house, which was exceptionally noisy, constant, creaking from upstairs floorboards, soft, patternless taps from the walls. Around midnight, Eleanor noticed the fire, despite being fed, was dwindling, flames flickering weakly as if something were sapping their heat. The room temperature dropped visibly. Their breaths misted. Samuel stood to add wood but froze, eyes fixed beyond the window. Eleanor followed his gaze and felt her stomach clench. Lights moved fluidly among the trees, not natural, but pulsing gently like candles carried by invisible beings. They advanced slowly along the path, stopping at the clearing's edge to form a semicircle facing the house, just watching, waiting. Then the whispers began, not from outside, but from the walls themselves, overlapping voices in unrecognizable cadences that nonetheless formed a call, an invitation, a demand. Eleanor covered her ears, but the whispers persisted, resonating inside her head. Samuel pulled her to the room's center, away from walls and windows. Back to back, they watched as shadows on the walls moved independently of the light, sliding and contorting into near figures. The notebook on the table began flipping pages on its own, stopping at a faded entry. Home is not just a place, it's a door, and doors work both ways. A violent crash sounded from upstairs, then another and another, a series of impacts shaking the ceiling, dust falling from the beams. The sound of heavy, deliberate footsteps descended the stairs, yet nothing was visible, only the sound drawing closer. Eleanor felt a presence behind her, so near she sensed something like breath on her neck. She turned, but Samuel was across from her, equally terrified. No one else was there. Yet the feeling remained, the absolute certainty of an invisible presence, watching with an attention that made her skin crawl. The outside lights pulsed in sync with the invisible footsteps, creating a hypnotic rhythm. Eleanor felt dizzy, as if the ground tilted though it remained level. The world seemed less solid, reality itself becoming malleable. Samuel held her firmly, but she saw in his eyes he felt it too. The house was altering their perception, opening their minds to something normally hidden. And through that opening, something was looking back, something ancient and patient that had long waited to be acknowledged. The fire died to faint embers. The lamps flickered out one by one. Eleanor and Samuel stood in the center of the darkening room, surrounded, aware the house was finally revealing its true nature, and aware it might already be too late to escape whatever was about to happen. The darkness that enveloped Cartwright House that night was absolute. It was not merely the absence of light, but something denser and more tangible, as if the shadows themselves had gained substance. Eleanor and Samuel remained motionless at the room's center, their short, rapid breaths the only sounds they dared make. Then, as suddenly as the lights had vanished, they returned. Yet something had shifted. The room appeared different. The furniture was in its place. The walls bore their familiar marks. But the atmosphere now held a strange quality, as if viewed through a thin veil. Colors seemed slightly faded, outlines less defined. Eleanor blinked repeatedly, but the sensation persisted. Samuel pointed to the window. The forest lights had disappeared, but now the landscape outside was visible, bathed in a pale luminescence with no identifiable source. And this landscape was wrong. The trees stood in subtly different positions. The horizon line had shifted. It was an alternate version of the same place. A movement caught Eleanor's attention. In the mirror on the opposite wall, she saw something that paralyzed her. The reflection showed the room as it should be, but it contained figures, translucent, unstable human silhouettes, occupying the space around them. Turning to look directly revealed nothing. Only through the mirror were the figures visible. They were people, or had been. Men and women in clothing from various eras, some from the previous century, others more recent. All shared the same expression of confusion and despair. They moved slowly, as if trapped in a dream, repeating meaningless actions. A woman arranged invisible flowers on a non-existent table. A man gazed out the window without truly seeing. Samuel whispered that he saw them too, and he recognized some from the notebook descriptions and local stories. They were the former residents of Cartwright House, all those who had lived there and never truly left. The house had kept them, trapped between existence and oblivion, stuck in an eternal repetition of their final days. One figure approached an elderly man, stooped, with empty eyes that seemed to look through Eleanor. He moved his lips soundlessly, his trembling hand reaching out to point insistently toward the stairs to the upper floor. The gesture was urgent, as if communicating something vital. Eleanor felt an inexplicable compulsion to follow. Part of her mind screamed that ascending was the worst idea, but a deeper part knew she needed to understand, to see what the house was trying to show. Samuel held her hand firmly, and together they began to climb, each step creaking with an echo that seemed to extend beyond the house's physical space. The second-floor hallway was filled with more spectral figures, moving aimlessly, passing through each other, ignoring Eleanor and Samuel entirely. It was like watching multiple recordings, playing simultaneously different moments from the house's history, all superimposed in the same space. The door to Eleanor's studio was ajar, emitting a different, brighter, almost golden light. They approached slowly, pushing it fully open. What they saw left them speechless. The room was transformed. The walls were no longer painted wooden planks, but ancient stone, carved with the same symbols Eleanor had seen in the basement, now pulsing softly with their own light as if breathing. The ceiling had vanished, revealing a vast, deep sky filled with unrecognizable star constellations. Where Eleanor's easel once stood, there was now an altar not built, but intrinsic, as if it had always existed, and the modern house had been constructed around it, never fully concealing it. Samuel approached the altar, fascinated despite his fear. Its smooth surface bore depressions forming complex patterns. He recognized some symbols from his research ancient linguistic fragments he had encountered in obscure texts. Seeing them here revealed they were far more than historical curiosities. An understanding formed in his mind. Cartwright House had not been built here by chance. Someone, perhaps long before European colonization, had discovered this land's unique properties. This space was a border between worlds, and centuries later, a house built atop it, whether by design or ignorance, became a focal point where normal barriers grew permeable. Everyone who lived here was affected, each leaving a part of themselves impregnated in the walls, the floors, the very essence of the place. Eleanor touched one carved wall, and upon contact, she saw not with her eyes, but with something deeper, the complete history of the place. Layer upon layer of time unfolded before her consciousness. The first people performing rituals under starry skies, long before any house existed. The construction of the original house, the arrival of each inhabitant, their experiences, their growing fear, their hasty departures. More than that, she saw what lay on the other side, observed through the cracks this place created in reality. She realized everything they had experienced, the frights, the manifestations, were not attacks, but attempts at communication. Something on the other side was trying to reach them, not to harm, but to be recognized and understood. The revelation was both terrifying and strangely reassuring. Cartwright House wasn't evil. It was a point of convergence where different realities touched. Those who stayed long enough began to perceive both sides, existing simultaneously in two states, two versions of the same reality. Eleanor removed her hand from the wall, returning fully to the physical world. She saw in Samuel's eyes that he understood too. They now had a choice: leave in the morning as planned, carrying this unsettling understanding, but leaving the house behind, or stay to explore more deeply what this place truly was, becoming part of its ongoing story. The decision would change everything. As the impossible sky above pulsed with alien stars, Eleanor and Samuel remained on the border between the known and the incomprehensible, considering their path. Dawn arrived like a liberation, its silvery light heralding sunrise. Eleanor and Samuel had stayed in the studio all night, watching as the strange sky gradually dissolved, replaced by the ordinary wooden ceiling. The carved stone walls vanished like mist under the sun, revealing once more the white-painted boards. The altar transformed back into the simple easel where Eleanor painted. Downstairs, the house looked different in daylight, more ordinary, less threatening. The spectral figures were gone. The disturbing sounds had ceased. It was as if the house had shown them what it wished, and now allowed them to consider what to do with that knowledge. Eleanor made coffee, while Samuel organized his thoughts on paper, trying to capture the experience while fresh. They both knew they had encountered something beyond common explanation, something that would fundamentally alter their perception of the world. The question was, what to do with this change. Over breakfast, they discussed options in hushed tones, as if speaking too loudly might attract unwanted attention. They could leave as planned, abandon Cartwright House, and try to rebuild normal lives elsewhere. Yet they knew the knowledge they now possessed could not be forgotten. They would live with the certainty of reality's hidden layers. The alternative was to stay, at least a while longer, to better understand their discovery, not to remain indefinitely, but to document, to learn, perhaps to find a way to help the trapped presences. Eleanor thought of the figures they had seen, those souls or impressions frozen in eternal repetition. There was a profound sadness to it, something that touched her as an artist who understood the importance of leaving a mark. Samuel was torn between instinctive fear and intellectual curiosity. As a writer who had always sought to understand human experience, the house offered material beyond imagination. But there was a cost. Each day spent there would bring them closer to that threshold, blurring the lines between worlds, eventually perhaps transforming them into what they had seen in the mirror. They spent the day exploring the property in sunlight, seeing it with new eyes. The cistern Robert Dalton had mentioned years before remained, its wooden lid warped by time. In daylight, it appeared merely an old cistern. Whatever Robert had seen was now hidden, or perhaps never truly there as he imagined. The barn at the back was a leaning structure with rotting wood. Inside, they found only abandoned tools, old hay, and marks on beams that could be names or natural wear. Eleanor noticed some marks formed patterns similar to the symbols engraved in the basement and transformed studio, as if someone had tried to replicate and study them. Walking the property's edge, Samuel observed something peculiar. The forest closest to the house contained old, twisted trees growing at strange angles, as if pushing away from something. Yet about 50 meters out, the forest normalized. Trees grew straight. Undergrowth was typical. Birds sang normally. A radius of influence existed, a perimeter where normal rules bent slightly, with the house at its epicenter, the point of greatest intensity. This explained why experiences were stronger inside, why the basement and second floor were the most active areas, being respectively deepest in the earth and highest toward the sky. Returning home in late afternoon, they discovered something previously unnoticed. On the back door frame, someone had carved the date 1889. The house was older than they thought, predating the earliest known stories. How many generations of residents had passed through before accounts were recorded? How many lives had been altered before anyone thought to document what happened? Eleanor decided to paint to process the experience. In her studio, she set up a new canvas and let her hand move freely without conscious direction. What emerged surprised her. Not horrors or spectral figures, but something subtler. She painted the house in its context, surrounded by forest, with an ethereal quality as if seen through water. And around it she suggested other forms, other versions of the same structure superimposed, existing simultaneously in different states. It was her attempt to visually capture her understanding that Cartwright House existed in multiple layers of reality at once. Meanwhile, Samuel returned to the notebook. Rereading each entry with renewed understanding, he saw the previous writers were not hysterical, but honest observers of genuine phenomena. Their descriptions, in light of what he and Eleanor now knew, made perfect sense pieces of a larger puzzle, each resident contributing a perspective to a broader truth. He added his own entry, not as a warning, but as a record. He described their experiences, visions, revelations, and the understanding they had reached, the dual nature of the place, not simply haunted, but a point of convergence. He hoped future occupants might read his words and be spared some of the terror born of ignorance. As night fell again, Eleanor and Samuel prepared differently. They lit the lamps without desperation, kept the hearth fire burning without frantic need for light, and sat together, waiting to see what the new night would bring. Now aware they were participating in something much larger than themselves, when the first shadows began to move on the walls and soft whispers emanated from the structure, they did not recoil in terror. Instead, they watched with something close to reverence, trying to understand, to find patterns, to decipher the language this place spoke. For now, they knew Cartwright House was not their enemy. It was a mystery, an enigma likely never fully solved. But it was also a window to something beyond, and they had decided to look through it, at least a little longer. The weeks that followed brought a subtle yet profound transformation to Eleanor and Samuel's relationship with the Cartwright House. What had once been pure terror gradually shifted into something more complex, a mixture of caution, respect, and an almost scientific curiosity. They began noticing patterns within the manifestations, rhythms that repeated themselves as if the house followed its own cycles, governed by rules they did not yet fully understand. Eleanor established a routine of visual documentation. Each morning, she would return to her studio and paint the impressions that had formed in her mind overnight. These were not literal depictions, as certain phenomena defied direct capture. Instead, she worked with abstract colors and forms, deep blues bleeding into dark reds, spirals suggesting movement, shadows that seemed to possess their own weight and presence, to convey the essence of her experiences. Her paintings began changing, not just in theme, but in technique. Sometimes, upon waking, she would find marks on her canvases she did not remember making, brushstrokes she did not recognize, styles belonging to other eras, as if former occupants were working through her, contributing their own artistic impressions. Samuel delved even deeper into the texts and symbols they had discovered. He meticulously copied every mark from the basement, every symbol carved into the walls, searching for patterns and meanings. Days were spent in the nearest town's small library, researching old books on esoteric symbols, forgotten practices, and the history of Missouri's pre-colonial inhabitants. His discoveries were equally fascinating and disturbing. Many ancient cultures recognized special places where the veil between worlds was thinnest sacred or forbidden sites, places of power that invariably attracted both reverence and fear. One afternoon, in a dusty tome on the mystical geography of the Americas, he found an obscure reference noting that certain areas of central Missouri had been considered neutral territory by rival tribes, not by treaty, but by mutual understanding that those lands belonged to something beyond human jurisdiction. They were not for living or hunting, but for observing from a distance, for respecting and leaving untouched. This ancestral knowledge was lost or ignored with the arrival of new settlers who saw unoccupied land and assumed it free for the taking. They built their homes and farms, then encountered the inexplicable. Samuel began suspecting the Cartwright House was not unique. There were likely similar places scattered throughout the region, perhaps the entire country, but this one was particularly strong, perhaps because its original builder had chosen the location deliberately, constructing the house in a specific way to amplify the land's natural properties. During his nighttime explorations, Samuel observed that each room on the second floor held a slightly different quality. Eleanor's studio intensified visual perceptions, making visions more vivid. His former office seemed to affect thought and understanding, where revelations and connections formed spontaneously. The third room, where they had found the warnings engraved on the walls, was the most intense, the point where the overlap between realities was most complete. They avoided it often, not out of fear, but from a cautious respect, like standing near a precipice. About a month after deciding to stay, something new occurred. Eleanor was painting in her studio when she realized she was not alone. A spectral figure, a middle-aged woman in late 19th century attire, stood there, more solid than before, almost tangible. This time, Eleanor felt no fear, but a strange connection. The woman moved slowly between canvases as if in a gallery, her posture suggesting recognition, even approval. Eleanor sensed this woman had also been an artist in life, understanding the impulse to capture the inexpressible. The figure turned, and for the first time, her eyes truly focused, holding awareness, recognition, something like gratitude. She raised a hand in a gesture that might have been a greeting or a blessing, then slowly faded away. Eleanor sat for a long time afterward. The encounter had not been terrifying, but almost comforting, a confirmation that the presences were not threats, but witnesses, people who had lived and left part of themselves imprinted here, now aware of the new occupants, observing, perhaps even communicating in their own way. Samuel had a similar experience days later. Working late in his office, he noticed someone reading over his shoulder, the elderly man who had directed them upstairs weeks before. The man looked at Samuel's pages with what seemed like interest or approval. Samuel remained still, not wanting to break the moment. The man extended a trembling hand, pointing to a passage about the house as a point of convergence, then slowly nodded, a simple gesture saying, "You understand." These encounters grew more frequent. The spectral figures became more present, more aware of Eleanor and Samuel. There were no traditional conversations, but communication occurred through gestures, expressions, emotions transmitted directly between consciousnesses. By remaining, by accepting rather than resisting, they had crossed a threshold, allowing more direct interaction with the other occupants. Yet with this came a disturbing realization. Eleanor began noticing her own reflection in mirrors, sometimes appeared slightly translucent, especially at night. Samuel found himself struggling to remember whether certain events happened yesterday, a week ago, or longer. Time was becoming fluid, less linear, more circular. They discussed these changes openly, without denial. They were becoming part of the house, as all previous residents had. Each day imprinted more of their essence onto the walls, floors, and atmosphere. Eventually, if they stayed long enough, they too would become spectral figures, trapped in repetitions, watching future residents with eyes gradually losing the ability to distinguish past from present. This forced them to confront a decision they had postponed. How much longer would they stay? They had learned much, documented extensively, gained insights few humans ever possessed. But there was a point of no return. Once they crossed over completely, they would become permanently part of Cartwright House, added to its collection of imprinted souls. Eleanor looked at her paintings, dozens now filling the studio. Her legacy, evidence she had been there, had seen, had understood. Samuel looked at his notebooks, filled with notes, observations, theories, his testimony, his contribution to knowledge of the inexplicable. But they both knew they would eventually have to choose. Leave while they still could, taking what they had learned to share with the outside world, or stay, becoming permanent guardians of this strange, sacred place, joining their voices to the nightly chorus of whispers. The decision weighed heavily as another night descended. Lamps lit, fire tended. They sat together in the living room, hands intertwined, aware time to choose was running out. The Cartwright house waited patiently, as it always had. For the house, time was relative days, years, decades, eventually merging into a continuous eternity, where past and present coexisted without clear distinction. As shadows danced on the walls and whispers began their nightly chorus, Eleanor and Samuel considered their ultimate destiny, aware there was no wrong choice, only different ways of becoming part of something far greater than themselves alone. Morning arrived shrouded in a dense fog that made the landscape around Cartwright House dreamlike and unreal. Eleanor woke first, watching the faint light through the curtains. Beside her, Samuel slept soundly. She memorized his face, knowing important decisions approached. Downstairs, she made coffee and sat at the table where so many conversations had occurred. Samuel's leather notebook lay open to his last entry. Eleanor picked up a pen and wrote her own contribution, something she felt necessary before any decision. She wrote of the changes in herself, how her dreams had become more vivid than reality at times, how she constantly felt the other occupants' presence, even by day. She wrote of her paintings, works that seemed to come through her rather than from her, as if she were merely a channel, but she also wrote of beauty. Despite the fear and strangeness, there was something profoundly beautiful in their discovery. The idea that reality was vaster, more complex, more mysterious than most would ever know, that consciousness did not simply end, but persisted in ways defying common understanding. There was comfort in that, even wrapped in terror. Samuel came down as she wrote, poured coffee, and waited patiently. When she finished, they looked at each other, communicating wordlessly the full weight of their situation. That day, they did something they hadn't since the house revealed its nature. They simply lived. They walked the fog-shrouded fields, stopping at the tree line where the house's influence diminished, watching the forest return to normal. Eleanor gathered wildflowers, real, tangible, ordinary feeling their texture, anchoring herself in the physical world. Samuel sat on a fallen log, watching leaves move in the wind, listening to distant birdsong, remembering what normal felt like. Returning in the early afternoon, Samuel suggested preparing an elaborate dinner, a mundane activity to reconnect with ordinary life. Eleanor agreed. They spent hours in the kitchen working in sync, chopping vegetables, seasoning meat, preparing sauces. The house remained quiet around them, the spectral presences absent, the whispers silent, as if respecting this respite. They ate as the sunset painted the sky orange and pink. The food was delicious, perhaps the best they'd ever made together. They talked of trivial memories and old plans, laughed, something they hadn't done in ages, and for a few hours managed to forget where they were. But when night fell completely, reality returned. They cleaned the kitchen in silence. Then, without discussion, moved toward the stairs. There was something they needed to do, something avoided since that first revealing night. Return to the third room. They climbed slowly, each step a commitment. The hallway was shadowed, their lamps creating small islands of light. They stopped before the door, Samuel's fingers hovering over the knob before turning it. The door opened silently. The room had changed since their last visit. The warnings on the wall seemed less threatening, more like advice from concerned friends. The air was thick, charged with energy that made Eleanor's arm hairs stand on end. Samuel felt the temperature drop. They placed their lamps around the room, creating a perimeter of light, then sat back to back in the center as they had that first terrifying night. But now there was no fear. Only acceptance, openness, a willingness to fully experience whatever this place wished to show. Minutes passed in silence. Then, gradually, the room began to change. The walls became translucent, revealing overlapping layers of time. Eleanor could see through them to earlier versions of the room, different occupants from different times, all sitting or standing in this same space, each seeking understanding, each confronting the mystery of the Cartwright House in their own way. She saw a woman alone, dressed in mid-19th century clothing, kneeling at the room's center, with hands outstretched, as if in prayer or supplication. She saw a man standing at the window, watching something outside that she could not make out. She saw a couple, not unlike herself and Samuel, holding on to each other as the reality around them dissolved into kaleidoscopic patterns. Samuel experienced his own visions. He saw the original builder's men with simple tools, but profound knowledge positioning each plank with specific intent, creating not just a structure, but an instrument of some kind. He saw those who came before the house, figures wrapped in skins and natural fabrics, dancing around a fire on this very spot, their movements tracing patterns in the air that corresponded to the symbols carved in the basement. Then they both saw something more, something that transcended individual visions and became a shared experience. The room around them completely disappeared, and for an immeasurable moment, they existed in a space that was both nowhere and everywhere, vast and intimate simultaneously, filled with a presence that had no form but undeniable awareness. It was not a single entity. They realized it was more like an ecosystem of consciousnesses, layers upon layers of experiences, memories, and emotions left by everyone who had touched this place throughout countless ages. And at its center was something even older, something that existed before humans walked the earth, something that simply was, needing no explanation or purpose beyond its own existence. Tears streamed down Eleanor's face, though she could not tell whether from fear, awe, or a mixture of both. Samuel held her hand tightly, anchoring her, anchoring himself, as they experienced together something few humans ever had, a direct glimpse of the vastness beyond the narrow limits of ordinary perception. Gradually, they returned. The room solidified around them once more. The walls were just walls again. The air, though heavy, became breathable. They remained seated for a long time, processing, integrating, trying to translate the ineffable into something their minds could hold without breaking. When they finally rose and left the room, something fundamental had shifted. The decision they had postponed was now clear, not through logic, but through deep understanding. They knew what they needed to do and why. Downstairs, Samuel tended the fire while Eleanor made tea. They sat together on the sofa, hands intertwined, and for the first time in weeks, spoke of the future with real clarity. They would leave, not out of fear, but because they had work to do in the outside world. Eleanor's paintings, Samuel's writings, the knowledge they had gathered all needed to be shared, carefully and thoughtfully, offering others the possibility of expanding their understanding of reality. But they would also return, not to live permanently, but as conscious visitors. The Cartwright House was not a prison, they realized. It was a portal, an access point to be approached with respect and intention rather than fear. They could come when they needed that connection, that expanded perspective, and then leave to integrate what they had learned. It was a balance, a dance between worlds. Perhaps, they thought, that was what the house had always wanted, not permanent occupants who would gradually dissolve within its walls, but conscious visitors who could serve as bridges, translating its truths to those who would never cross its threshold. They spent the rest of that night planning. They discussed how to present their findings, what forms their art and writing would take, how to balance honesty with responsibility, knowing not everyone was ready to confront what the Cartwright House represented. Some needed the security of concrete reality, and that was valid. But for those who sought more, who instinctively felt the world was vaster and stranger than they allowed themselves to believe, Eleanor and Samuel's works could serve as maps, guides, and quiet confirmations that they were not insane, that their perceptions of deeper layers were valid. As the sun began to rise, painting the sky in soft pastels, they were still awake but not exhausted. They felt energized with renewed purpose. They had confronted the mystery at the heart of Cartwright House and emerged not broken, but transformed, carrying gifts of understanding few possessed. They would begin packing that day, preparing to depart properly, but without rush or panic. They would leave when ready, and the house would let them go. For now there was mutual understanding, a respect transcending the old dynamic of fear and flight. In the morning light that filled the room, pushing shadows back to their daytime hiding places, Eleanor looked around with new eyes. She saw Cartwright House not as frightening or malevolent, but as what it truly was, a place of transition, a liminal space where different forms of existence briefly touched. It was strange, yes, challenging, certainly, but also sacred in its own way, deserving reverence as much as caution. Samuel squeezed her hand, wordlessly sharing the sentiment. They had entered as fugitives from ordinary life, seeking isolation and inspiration. They would leave as something different, transformed by experiences most would never believe, carrying knowledge that would fundamentally change everything they created from then on. And somewhere deep within the house, in the invisible layers existing alongside but separate from physical reality, the other presences watched and waited. For them, time held no such meaning. Eleanor and Samuel would return eventually. All who truly understood the house eventually returned. It was the nature of the place, its essential purpose, to call those who could see beyond the veil and offer them glimpses of eternity. The Cartwright House would wait patiently, as it always had, as it always would, through all seasons and years to come. A silent beacon for those rare individuals capable of perceiving its true nature and brave enough to cross its threshold in search of understanding. The days that followed were filled with silent farewells. Eleanor and Samuel packed their belongings carefully, but not hastily. There was a peace in those final moments at Cartwright House that neither had expected. The house remained quiet, almost comforting, as if approving their decision. On the last morning, Eleanor went to her studio one final time. Her paintings from the past weeks were carefully packed, ready for the journey. She stood in the center of the empty room, allowing herself to feel everything in last time. The light streaming through the window, the distinctive smell of old wood, the unique sensation of that space that had been both her sanctuary and her canvas. Samuel walked through the entire house, touching the walls, memorizing every detail. In the office where he had written so many pages, he stopped and took a deep breath. His notebooks were safely stored away, filled with observations and reflections that would transform everything he wrote from then on. He left the old leather notebook where he had found it, his own entries added to the voices that came before, a gift for whoever came after. At midday, the cart was loaded. They took one last walk around the property, bidding farewell to the fields, the surrounding forest, the stone cistern holding its secrets. The place seemed different now, less threatening, almost gentle in the clear daylight, as if the land itself were saying goodbye, acknowledging they had become a part of its history. Before leaving, Eleanor turned to the house one last time. For a moment, she thought she saw movement in the second-story windows, figures watching her leave. But when she blinked, there was only the reflection of clouds on the glass. Even so, she raised her hand in a farewell gesture and felt, inexplicably, that the gesture was reciprocated. The journey back to civilization was uneventful. As they drove away, they talked of the future, the galleries Eleanor would contact to exhibit her new works, the publishers Samuel would approach with his revised manuscript. They would not mention Cartwright House directly in their public works, not out of fear, but because they understood some truths were better conveyed through metaphor, through art that touched something deep within observers without necessarily explaining its source. Months later, settled in a distant city, they occasionally exchanged glances when something reminded them of that time, a specific pattern of shadows on a wall, a sound at night that echoed peculiarly, moments when reality seemed slightly thinner, more transparent. In those moments, they knew the Cartwright House remained there in the silent Missouri hills, waiting patiently. When Eleanor's paintings were finally exhibited, they provoked curious reactions. Some found them merely abstract and beautiful. Others stood before them for long minutes, restless, feeling something they could not name. And occasionally, someone would look at the canvases with recognition in their eyes, as if seeing something familiar that resonated with their own inexplicable experiences. Samuel's work also found its audience. Readers wrote saying his stories made them question the nature of reality, made them look at commonplaces and see possibilities they had previously ignored. Some shared their own experiences with strange places, moments when the world revealed hidden layers. A silent network of understanding began to form. As for the Cartwright House, it continued to exist as it always had. Another resident would eventually arrive, drawn by the isolation, the mystery, the good land, the affordable price. History would repeat itself in new ways, for each person would bring their own perceptions, fears, and capacity for understanding. Some would flee after a few nights, others would remain, trying to understand. And a rare few would find the balance Eleanor and Samuel had discovered. The cycle would continue layer upon layer of experiences accumulating on the walls, in the ground, in the very essence of the place. The house was neither good nor bad. It was simply a point where realities touched, a place of transition where those sensitive enough could glimpse beyond the normal limits of perception. As long as it existed, it would continue to call, whispering across distances, drawing those destined to cross its threshold. Eleanor and Samuel kept their promise. Years later, they returned for a brief visit. The house welcomed them like old friends, their presence acknowledged and accepted. They spent a night there, not with fear, but with reverence, renewing their connection to that unique space. In the morning, they departed again, carrying refreshed memories that would nourish their creations for years to come. And so the story of Cartwright House continues, not as a horror tale, but as a reminder that the world is vaster and more mysterious than we allow ourselves to believe in the rush of daily life. That there are places where the veil thins, where other realities press against our own, where those with courage and openness can experience something beyond the ordinary. the house remains in the Missouri hills, hidden among ancient trees, waiting, always waiting. And perhaps, somewhere deep within its consciousness, it holds the memories of all who have passed through its doors, all who have sat in its rooms, all who have confronted its mysteries, a gallery of souls imprinted in time, silent witnesses to the eternal dance between the known and the unknown. This has been our journey through the history of the Cartwright House. If you have made it this far, if you have allowed yourself to explore this mystery with us, please consider leaving a like and subscribing to the channel. We would love to hear your thoughts on places that challenge our understanding of reality. Until the next story, take care.